And I'm on a moment. I think, yep. Um, so it's so great to be here, and I'm really grateful that Alicia offered a slot to me to speak about domestic abuse, which is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I've been doing this work for many years, and I'm really grateful to be able to share some of it with you. Um, Before we get started, I always share that, I am going to be talking about violence, which is a hard topic to hear about. I know that domestic violence happens in our communities and touches a lot of people directly and indirectly. So I always assume that there may be people in an audience that I might be speaking to that have experienced it, or it may have touched your life in some ways. So I am going to be talking about violence that have occurred with people that I've worked with. So I just encourage you to do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Um, Even though I recognize a lot of people here, there are some folks I don't know. So for people that I don't know, my connection to the Carpenter's Boat Shop is that I am Bobby and Ruth's youngest child, and I was raised at the boat shop on campus. When I was 19, I took a leave of absence from college, and for the first time, I actually experienced life at the boat shop as an apprentice. So I spent the winter and spring and summer that year building boats and working with wood, and it was a wonderful experience, as it is for most apprentices. Um, and then a few years after that, I was able to join the board of directors, and I spent about 7 or 8 years on the board. And I've just stayed in touch with the boat shop in many other ways through my connection with apprentices and instructors, and it will always be a very important part of my life. Um, so those of you who know my dad and who may have known my mom will not be surprised to know that I was really lucky to have been raised by people who were loving and compassionate parents. Domestic abuse and violence was not something that I knew a whole lot about when I was a kid. Um, but there were two experiences in my life as a child that were really impactful to me and in some ways led me towards the work as a domestic violence advocate. The first experience happened when I was about 11 or 12. We were getting ready for church. It was a Sunday morning. And as we were getting ready for church, there was a knock at the door, which was unusual. For folks that have been to the boat shop, you know that people just kind of come in. So hearing a knock at the door was a little startling to us all. And my mom answered the door, and there was a woman there who was upset. She looked disheveled. She was crying. So my mom went outside with her and chatted for a little while. And then she came back and told us that we were going to give this woman a ride up to town and bring her to the bus station, which was just downtown Damariscotta. So we drove up to town, and my mom bought her a bus ticket at Waltz's drugstore, and then this woman went on her way, and we went on to church. So my mom shared with me that that woman had been in a relationship with a man in Bristol, and he had been violent towards her and was abusive. And that woman woke up that Sunday morning and walked to the boat shop from his house before he woke up. And she walked to the boat shop knowing that my mom would be able to help her get out. So that was really the first experience that I had of really knowing about violence in interpersonal relationships like that. Of course, my mom was known for helping people and helped people throughout my whole childhood. But this was a kind of a unique situation. Um, it also kind of opened my eyes to the fact that people lead different lives and that people can have many different identities. I happen to know the man who was abusive to this woman. He certainly wasn't a saint, but he was always very pleasant to me. And it was really alarming to know that he was capable of frightening this woman to the point where she had to walk to our house and escape in the way that she did. Um, so that was one experience. And the second was in high school. And in 1998, a woman who had been raised in Bristol named Candace Butler, she was shot and killed by her husband, who she had recently left. Now, Candy, she didn't live in Bristol when she was murdered, but her family lived in Bristol and her sister lived next door to us. So when Candy's husband shot her, he then killed himself. leaving their two children as orphans. And those two kids were just a little younger than me, and they ended up moving in next door to the boat shop to live with their aunt. And the son in that family, he was just a year younger than me, and he ended up spending quite a lot of time with our family and at the boat shop when he was a young adult, and even actually built a skiff while he was in high school. So he and I, we were friends and we spent time together, but we never talked about his experience of losing his mom so tragically. But it was it was just such an impactful experience to know him and to know that people are living in homes where there's violence and they're living these really horrible lives. And I just felt such a deep sense of gratitude for the first time, kind of knowing how other people live and how fortunate I was to have had a family that was so loving and compassionate to me. Um, so then several years later, when I was in college at UMaine, I had the opportunity to do a work study job at the domestic violence shelter up in Bangor called Partners for Peace. So I spent my senior year working in that shelter and covering the helpline and working with survivors up in the Bangor, Penobscot County area. And it was work that I just felt so connected to. I just felt really, it was really rewarding. I felt really honored to support people who were experiencing such tragedy in their lives and were really seeking support from these organizations. So I knew it was work I really wanted to continue doing, but I wasn't sure if I could emotionally handle it because it's really hard and there's a lot of turnover in these kinds of jobs because you're hearing about really hard things and you're seeing a lot of sadness. So I wanted to do the work a second time, but in kind of in an area where I knew I wouldn't be employed, but kind of like trying it out as like an intern. So I ended up taking an AmeriCorps position in Juneau, Alaska, and I worked in Juneau for 1 year at a shelter for survivors of domestic violence. So that was a really another really wonderful experience for me to have because I mostly worked with children in the shelter, but I also worked with women and sometimes men who were impacted by domestic violence. And I was able to really just be immersed in the work and do it full time, and it kind of solidified my passion for the work. And I knew that it was something I wanted to continue doing. So as I wrapped up that year as an AmeriCorps volunteer, a job happened to open up back in my home community at New Hope for Women. We are now called New Hope Midcoast, but at the time we were New Hope for Women. And so I applied from Juneau and I ended up getting hired and I was able to return to back home to Lincoln County. And I've been at New Hope for about 16 years now in many different positions. And I am currently our residential services director. So I oversee our shelter and housing program and do a lot of other things on top of that, but that is my primary position now. So that's just a little bit about my background and how I got interested in this work and how I've been kind of getting into it. So I'm gonna take a moment and share my screen now. And we're gonna get into our PowerPoint to talk a little bit more about what domestic violence is and how it impacts folks. So just hold on a moment. Oops, I think it's gonna show up at the end because Alicia and I were practicing. Here we go.
Perfect.
Everyone can see that?
Yes, thank you, Hannah.
Okay. So during my little talk, we'll talk about what domestic violence is, some of the tactics of abuse, who is impacted and the scope of this, and talk about some justifications that folks use, as well as why people leave versus stay. And then at the end, I'll talk about New Hope specifically and our services. So we talk about domestic violence using this 5-point definition. And the definition starts with the fact that this is a pattern of coercive and controlling behavior and not an isolated incident of physical violence. Some people, we all have ideas of what domestic violence is. It's portrayed in media in different ways, but domestic abuse and violence is a pattern, and it often happens gradually. It starts sometimes slowly, but then it does usually increase and escalate over time. But it is more than one instance of abuse or violence. It occurs in the context of a relationship. Obviously, people can be violent towards one another, but domestic abuse is violence within the family or within intimate partners or caregivers. It is intimidating, threatening, or harmful behavior with the purpose of creating fear. And it is purposeful and chosen behavior. We're going to talk about that point of the definition a little bit in a little while, but it is not out of control, but it is a chosen behavior. And those that commit acts of violence towards their partners or family members often hold this belief system that they have the right and they're entitled to abusing their partners or family members, and that they have the right to limit their civil and human rights. So this is an image that was created in 1981 by a group of survivors who were in a support group in Duluth, Minnesota. They were talking about the abuse that they'd experienced, and one person made a comment that it sounded like they were dating the same man because they had all experienced many similar tactics within their relationship, that their husbands or boyfriends had harmed them in similar ways. So they created this image, which is called the power and control wheel. And it's an image that we use as an education tool. And also we use it with survivors and victims that we work with to try to help them to feel less alone, because it is, as you know, when I work individually with women, they will often feel like their experience is unique, which of course it is. However, I think it can be really helpful for survivors to feel like what they've experienced is not the only, that they're not the only ones. They often will blame themselves for what has happened. And when they see that this is in writing, and these different tactics of abuse that have been laid out here by other survivors, it can feel really validating. So this image is, as I said, a power and control wheel. The spokes of the wheel contain 8 different tactics. And these are what are often used sort of, they can be kind of gradually used, or, they may be used daily. It really depends on the situation. And regardless of what happens, the ultimate fear that is instilled by using these tactics is the potential or the reality that they could be experiencing physical or sexual violence. So on the outside of the wheel, it says physical sexual violence. And that is the ultimate fear that a lot of victims feel as they experience these different tactics within the wheel. And on the inside is power and control, which is what abusers use. That's what they achieve once they have used these different tactics of abuse. So a lot of these, examples, we hear about really regularly in our work at New Hope. And, it can be really confusing sometimes. Some of these experiences can be very confusing and hard for survivors to really understand what's going on, especially things like, for example, using isolation. This is one that a lot of survivors talk about in the context that it may have happened sort of gradually and maybe under the guise of love. So, as you enter into a new relationship, a lot of times new partners want to spend all their time together, and they want to, just kind of go out on the weekends. They don't really want to include other people. And in healthy and balanced relationships, the partners will then separate and spend more time with their friends and family, and come back together, of course, and spend time with each other and other couples. But in relationships where one person wants to dominate and control the other person, they will sometimes make their victim feel guilty if they want to spend time with other people. And that can be really confusing, I think, for victims, especially at first, because they may say, well, it's just because I want to spend so much time with you, and it's because, all I want to do is be with you, and there's nothing wrong with that. So, and then after a while, it can maybe escalate to, maybe a person will go out with their friends and they'll be getting text repeatedly from their abusive partner. And they start to think, well, why are they checking up on me? They must be worried about me. Oh, and it's maybe because they're worried that they're going to be cheated on, and maybe because the person claims to have been cheated on in the past by lots of other ex-girlfriends or ex-wives. So it can feel like, well, as the victim is experiencing this, they may feel justified, like the person really does care about them, and this is really only about, just checking in. But the reality is that they really want the person to be under their control, and they want them to spend time with them only, and they feel really jealous if they're spending time with other people. Um, Other tactics here, using children is another common one. A lot of people stay in relationships. We'll talk a little bit more about why people stay or leave, but a lot of people can be controlled in their relationship because of the fear that their children may be harmed. Children do, of course, get harmed by their abusive parents. Um, but oftentimes the threat that they may be taken away from the parent is enough to keep somebody in a relationship. Um, Using economic abuse is something that the majority of people, when they say that they've been in abusive relationships, the majority say that economic abuse was used toward them. Um, and economic abuse can, again, it can look kind of positive in some ways. I've worked with many women, especially in our residential program, who at first were told by their partner, if you want to have children and stay home with your kids, you're fine to do that. I'm happy to work, and you can stay home and quit your job and just be a stay-at-home mother. And that can feel really great for a lot of people, a lot of parents that want to raise their children like that. Um, However, there are many people that we've worked with who then said that they wanted to go back to work, or they wanted to put their children in daycare, and their partner at that point said, no, we're not, that's not going to happen, or you're a bad mother for wanting to go back to work. And so they end up making choices where they may not have an opportunity to earn any income, which leaves them really isolated and also without the ability to be independent financially. Um, some people do, work with, they may both work outside of the home. But when somebody wants to control somebody financially, they may request or require them to put all of their money into one account that the victim may not have access to. Um, so we sometimes will work with people who really have no access to any money at all, and they are left, just completely living in poverty. If they decide to leave, they know that they will not have any access to any of their own money. Um, Emotional abuse is another that we hear quite a lot about, and that looks like put downs, insulting, being critical of just anything that the person might do. A lot of people that we work with, when they come to us, they really feel like they have lost themselves, because for many years they may have heard nothing but criticisms, and they start to really feel like they are not capable of doing anything right, because anytime they're at home, they don't do the dishes the right way, they don't parent the children the right way, they're not wearing the right clothes. And after a while, that really does affect somebody's self-esteem, and they feel like they cannot, that they're not able to live independently without this person, because, this person really does everything right and they do everything wrong. And it really is a very hard thing to come back from, for a lot of people that make the choice to leave. And, they'll share that sometimes the scars of the emotional abuse last much longer than the physical violence that they may have experienced. So part of our work is we use what we call an empowerment model, where when we talk to people on the phone or in person, we really want to empower them to make decisions for themselves because for many people, if not most, they have not been capable of making decisions for themselves, or if they have made decisions, they've been criticized. So we really want people to feel as though they can make decisions for themselves, and we will be supportive of those decisions. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but yeah, so you can see some of the other examples. But the physical violence that people may experience, is quite common. Um, Sometimes people, work with New Hope and they haven't experienced physical violence, or they don't experience it very often. In fact, one person I worked with once said that she was assaulted during their honeymoon, and they had been married for decades, but that he had never physically harmed her since the honeymoon. But just the fear that he was capable of doing that then, knowing that he could do that again, just kind of kept her in submission for the entirety of their relationship. And so I think a lot of people, even though these tactics may not be, really obviously threatening, that fear that they could escalate to physical violence is enough to keep a lot of people in a relationship. Excuse me. All right. So the different types of violence that we hear about, we hear mostly about the top two, and I'll kind of get into what these are. So the coercive and controlling violence that we hear about is what I have discussed about domestic violence, the coercive and controlling behavior of one person dominating another one and using these tactics of abuse to try to control what they do, what they wear, who they see, what kind of employment they might have. And so one person using these tactics to really control the other person's actions, um, and oftentimes using these fear tactics. The second is called resistive and reactive violence, and we do hear about that quite a lot too. And that is what that looks like is oftentimes is used by a victim of domestic violence. So a victim of abuse might use resistive violence as self-defense. That's another term that is used. Recently, I actually worked with a woman who had been arrested for domestic violence, and she was using resistive and reactive violence. What had happened was that she had come home from her job, and she had been planning to go out to see her family, and her husband did not want her to go out. And so he took her phone away from her and he took her car keys. And she was really upset about this. She really wanted to go out. So she tried to get the phone from him, and he pushed her into a corner. He pushed her against the wall, and she grabbed at his hand where he was holding the keys, and she scratched his hand really badly to try to get her phone back and her car keys. And she got them out, and she left, and then he called the police, and she ended up getting arrested for domestic violence because the police saw these injuries on his hand. This happens, unfortunately, quite frequently, where a person, where law enforcement arrives on the scene and sees perhaps, a woman typically who is really hysterical, might be really upset, and is perhaps discussing what happened, where and she may have used violence towards her partner as he was also abusing her. Victims of domestic violence are usually more forthcoming when they're confronted by police. They feel like, oh, the law enforcement's here. I'm going to share what happened, and surely they'll believe me. But a lot of times, abusive people are so calm and collected, and they may deny what happened and say, "Oh no, she just attacked me out of nowhere." And unfortunately, law enforcement don't always do enough work to try to determine who the predominant aggressor is. And so they will see what they see and take evidence and collect evidence and see that, perhaps the man has more injuries than the woman. And so a lot of times victims of domestic violence are arrested for using this resistive and reactive violence. Sometimes a victim may use this reactive violence in a way where they may do it preemptively because they know that the violence is coming their way. So what I mean by that is a lot of times, this is, as I said earlier, this is a pattern and it's a cycle. And a lot of times abusers will kind of the tension and the aggression will be building over time. And then there may be what they call like an explosion period where they may use violence. And then there's what people sometimes call the honeymoon phase after the violence has occurred, where the person is very loving and regretful and really sorry for what happened. Um, and then the tension starts to build again, and then there's the explosion, and then there's the honeymoon period. So sometimes people refer to that as the cycle of violence. And so I remember working with a woman once who shared that she could feel this tension building, and then she knew her husband was going to be violent towards her at some point. And it was her daughter's high school graduation that was coming up, and they had family coming into town. So she chose to pick a fight with her husband a few days before the high school graduation in order for him to assault her and kind of get it out of the way. And then she knew that during that period where she really wanted there to be calm and peace within the home during this really monumental moment in their life with the high school graduation. And sure enough, she knew. And, he was very regretful and sorry and was very kind and loving to her and her family during that period, but she really wanted it to be. So it's interesting how victims can sometimes predict these different cycles and can do what they can to control a situation. They're not trying to control their partner, but they're trying to control a situation in a moment in time. So that's what we refer to as the resistive and reactive violence. Non-battering related violence really refers to when somebody may have a medical condition. Specifically, I'm thinking of somebody who may have developed dementia. We do sometimes hear about people who develop these health conditions and then perhaps start using violence towards their partner or other family members or caregivers. And the purpose of that violence is not to control their partner. It's not domestic violence in that same way as this coercive controlling violence, but it is, they may use violence, but it is because they're often afraid and trying to control a situation because they don't know what's going on, or they may just be really frightened. So we do get calls sometimes from, I would say most commonly from adult children who are worried about their aging parents who may be experiencing that kind of non-battering related violence. So as I said, domestic violence is very common. So it says more than 10 million adults experience domestic violence annually. It's on a national level. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 10 men will experience domestic abuse during their lifetime. Throughout the country in 2018, partner violence accounted for 20% of violent crime. And domestic violence helplines receive around 19,000 calls on a typical day. And at New Hope, in Maine specifically, and I guess I should back up and say that New Hope is one of 9 domestic violence agencies in Maine. We cover the 4 counties along the coast, which is Saginaw, Lincoln, Knox, and Waldo, from Bath to Belfast, basically. But there are 8 other domestic violence agencies that cover the state. We kind of break it up by counties. So throughout the state, let me see, over 14, oh, sorry, did I mess anything up on your end, Alicia?
We're still on the same screen of what's the scope.
Okay, sorry, I kind of moved my little picture here. So in Maine, over 14,000 people received help from one of the 9 domestic violence resource centers. In 2022, domestic violence accounted for 30% of all violent crimes, so a little higher than the national average. And then New Hope specifically in fiscal year 2024, we supported over 1,600 survivors and answered 4,500 helpline calls. And I'll talk a little bit more about our helpline and the services that we provide, but that, it certainly affects a lot of people. And we do a lot of work to try to promote our services and provide that, awareness so that people will reach out when they need it. So this is a little of a group activity if people want to participate. I'm just curious if people want to unmute and share what are some common justifications you've heard about why domestic violence happens? What are some things that you may have heard that may be the reason why an abuser may choose to use violence towards his partner or children?
Alcohol abuse.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really common one. So the use of drugs and alcohol. Any others?
That's the way they were raised. It's normal.
Yes, they experienced it as a child, so therefore they will continue that cycle.
I remember a situation, Hannah, where a woman finally left her husband because she said, I didn't mind when he went out on Fridays and Saturdays and got drunk and came home and beat me up. But when he started doing it on Monday and Wednesdays, it just became too much. So she was willing to accept it for those 2 evenings because that was normal. But when it turned into something a little bit more, became not normal for her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And again, domestic abuse generally escalates over time and happens more frequently over time. So sometimes people will say, if he'd hit me on the first date, I never would have gone out on a second date. Abusive people generally do not start using any kind of tactics, especially not physical or sexual violence, until after there's been some kind of commitment. So usually it's after they've been married or after the person may be pregnant or have had a child, where it makes it much harder to leave. But yeah. Any other justifications that folks want to share?
It's the victim's fault.
Yep. Yeah, they must have done something to deserve it.
I had a client that she gave us their 2 children Christmas morning, but she still didn't leave him. She left him after he shot the dog.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So these are the most common justifications that we hear from folks about why domestic violence happens. Some of them you all have shared. So stress and anger are common justifications. And what we know is that people who use violence towards their family members or partners don't have higher rates of stress in their life, and they are not more angry. They are they often are able to function very well in the world. And they choose to only use abuse and violence towards a select group of people, usually their partner and or children. So claiming that they are more stressed out and therefore, entitled to using this violence is a myth. People who are arrested for domestic violence, I would say up until about a couple of decades ago, they were often court ordered to attend anger management. And that was really the wrong intervention because, again, people that use violence towards their families are not out assaulting their coworkers or their mothers or their fathers. They're usually only assaulting or hurting their family members, not their coworkers. They're not going to run up to a stranger on the street and be angry. Of course, there are people who have that kind of anger, and maybe anger management is appropriate for them. But for people who use domestic violence, that is the incorrect intervention. The victim's behavior, like Phyllis said, they must deserve it in some way. And again, victims often blame themselves, and certainly abusers will blame the victim. If they had only, gotten dinner on the table at a certain time, if they hadn't made the children, get so worked up at supper time, they wouldn't have had to hit the kids. If they, hadn't, had to talk, go out with their sister on Friday night, they wouldn't have been so angry. So they're often blaming the victim for that. And again, this mutual abuse that it goes both ways. It takes two to tango. They often will say that people who use violence towards their partners have higher rates of drug and alcohol use, and that is another myth. Drugs and alcohol do not cause domestic violence. It can sometimes escalate domestic violence. So sometimes people may use these other tactics, as we talked about, within the wheel. So they may try to, they may be very critical of their partners. They may, prevent them from seeing friends or prevent them from working. And then maybe when they're using drugs or alcohol, they may use physical or sexual violence towards them. But what we know is that when abusers end their use of drugs and alcohol, if they become sober, the violence rarely stops, if ever. A lot of times survivors will really hope that they'll say, oh, it's the drugs, it's the alcohol that's causing this. And if they get sober and go through treatment, everything will be fine. And what we know is that they often co-occur, but they do not cause each other. Domestic violence isn't caused by substance use. So as we, work with survivors who, do blame the drugs or alcohol, we will often explore, like, what are they like when they're sober? Have they ever had periods of time where they were in recovery? And usually victims will share that the tactics may look a little different. They may not be as physically violent, but the abuse is still there and it's still occurring. In fact, I've heard from women before who say that the abuse and the violence got worse when their partners were sober because they were struggling with their sobriety. So it really kind of shows that, drugs and alcohol do not cause domestic abuse. Somebody mentioned a history of childhood abuse. That's another common justification and myth. So what we know is that many people experience domestic abuse as children. And if domestic violence was caused by domestic violence, we would see more rates of women using violence than men. So, many women and girls are also abused by their family members, and they do not go on to use violence. Many women, some women do, and I don't mean to sound like women are not, women do use violence, but it's at much lower rates than men. So, but what we know is that a lot of people who have been raised with domestic abuse go on to have very loving and compassionate relationships because they know how hurtful and harmful it was to be raised in that environment. So they make the complete opposite choice as their abusive parent and are often in very loving relationships as adults. And in fact, a lot of people share that they go on to having kind of helping professions. A lot of people that work in the domestic violence field were raised in homes where there was domestic abuse, and they go on to try to help other people. So it's certainly not the cause. And a lot of people think that it disproportionately affects people who live in poverty, and that is another myth. I mean, at New Hope, we work with people of any socioeconomic background, and we do, we work with people whose abusive partners are doctors and lawyers and police officers, and as well as, clam diggers and mechanics and, any kind of profession. So it really does not have anything to do with the kind of home that you're raised in or the kind of financial situation you have. Those types of stressors certainly may exacerbate things, but they do not cause there to be domestic abuse. As I said at the beginning, people who are abusive have a belief system that tells them it's okay to use violence and abuse. and that they have the right to do that. But this is always a choice that they're making. This out of control behavior, as I said, a lot of times victims will think that, that the person went into a rage and blacked out. And sometimes that's what abusers will say as well, is to justify what happened. Oh, I can't remember what happened. I was in a total rage. And one example that kind of dispels that myth is that, I worked with this woman who shared that her husband had come home and was really angry and started to destroy the house. And he was ripping everything up and destroying her clothes and smashed her car. And, as we were kind of exploring what happened, I asked, like, well, was he angry when he kind of came out of this rage to find that he had destroyed any of his stuff? And sure enough, his flat screen TV was fine. His truck was not touched. His clothes were fine. So it really kind of goes to show, like, when people are using this violence towards their partners, it is intentional, and they, are often in a position where they are, harming them in a certain way that will not reveal bruises to outsiders, or, they're very intentional about how they're doing it. So this is what we call the risk analysis, and we're going to talk about why people stay and leave. I'm sure many people have heard, the phrase, why doesn't she just leave? If she leaves, everything would be better. Just for the sake of time, I'm just going to go through this a little bit quickly. So, we when we hear people say, they should just leave, we want people to think about, what are the risks of staying in a relationship where there's violence occurring? What are we worried about for a victim? What are we thinking might happen to a victim if they stay in a relationship? And some of the common fears are that a victim might get killed, injured, they might lose their job, the children may experience abuse. The non-offending parent might lose access to their children because Child Protective may be involved and take the children away from the family. A victim may develop depression, lose their self-esteem, end up in poverty, develop an illness, or develop substance use to cope. Or they may end up killing themselves or attempting suicide. So to think about staying, and these are the different things that may occur, I want us to now think about what the risks are of leaving an abusive relationship. And as we think about that, do you think that a victim may be at risk of being killed if they leave? Yes. Victims of domestic violence have a really increased chance of being hurt or killed after they leave. The first 6 months after a separation from an abusive person is the most dangerous time for a victim. When we think about domestic violence homicides, 75% of women killed by their partners were killed after they left. So when we say she should just leave, that can be an incredibly dangerous idea. Not to say we wouldn't want to encourage leaving. We'll get into that in a minute, but to say that it's going to resolve their safety concerns is misleading. All of these fears of these risks of staying remain the same, and perhaps even become more pronounced if they leave, especially the risk of being killed. So leaving in and of itself is not it doesn't resolve it doesn't resolve their safety risk. It certainly does, it can lead to a safer life, but just leaving in and of itself is not always the most important thing to do. So what at New Hope and throughout the state, and I think many other domestic violence agencies throughout the country, we really focus on safety planning with victims and try to talk about how to leave in a safe way. We want to present them with ideas that might increase their safety. So, developing support systems outside of their relationship, perhaps, making a connection with a mental health provider that can help them. the use of protection from abuse orders is a wonderful tool that a lot of victims use. That is what some people call a restraining order. New Hope spends, we do a lot of work trying to help people get these court orders so that they might have some more legal protections if they leave their partners. We want to try to help them get connected to housing or shelter supports because, a lot of times when people leave, they have nowhere else to go. And so a lot of people will share with us that they might leave if they had another place to go. And of course, we're in the middle of a housing crisis, and it makes it much more difficult for people to leave because they often do end up homeless or living in poverty. But a lot of the work that New Hope does is to try to present survivors with ideas and options. And then we try to help them, problem solve. Like, what would it look like for you to, if we were to buy you a bus ticket, could you get to your mom's house in New Hampshire? Or, could we buy you a cell phone to have, kind of secretly, and then you can continue to work with us, without your partner knowing, to try to get connected to different housing resources. What about your kids? Are you going to be able to, remain in the same school district if you leave? So we really want survivors to know that we can, kind of present them with these options and, kind of help them problem solve what makes the most sense for them. Like I said earlier, a lot of victims feel really incapable of making decisions and feel really like at a loss of how to kind of move forward. And we really don't step in and say, you really should do this. You should get a protection order. You should call law enforcement. Because, not every situation, it's not a one size fits all. Like I said, we have worked with women before whose partners were police officers. And, certainly calling the police is not an option for people like that. And it may not even be an option to get a protection order because you need law enforcement to enforce those. So, we really take every situation as individual, and we want people to know kind of what their options might be based on what they want to do. So just kind of going into New Hope services, I want to make sure we have enough time. Sorry, it's kind of gone by quickly. So New Hope and many of the other domestic violence agencies throughout the country, but certainly in Maine, we all operate a 24-hour helpline. And we encourage anybody affected by domestic abuse to call us. So we get calls from victims and survivors of domestic violence, but we also get calls from concerned others and family members of people who are worried about the domestic violence that their loved one might be experiencing. So we're happy to speak to anybody about what's going on and try to help them figure out what, how they can best support their loved one. We also get calls from professionals. So we get calls quite frequently from area hospitals or from mental health providers who want to know how to support their patients. As I said, we do a lot of legal advocacy. So we'll help support people as they fill out their protection from abuse orders or help them if they need to separate legally from their partners through the divorce process. We offer some support groups and one-on-one support. We have 3 different offices. We have an office in Bath, Damascotta, and in Rockland. So people come into our offices to meet with us, but I would say most people connect with us by phone. We have a child protective services liaison. So if a family has domestic violence as part of the reason why Child Protective is involved with their life, we have a staff member who can help that family navigate this really complex system. Because a lot of times the non-offending parent has a lot of hoops that they have to jump through. If Child Protective is involved in their life, they may have these expectations of the non-offending parent, and they have to attend meetings and they have to maybe go to group. And so that advocate really helps that non-offending family member to understand what their rights are. We do not have a brick and mortar shelter. So all the other domestic violence agencies in Maine have a shelter, but we have never had a shelter. But we have, since the beginning of the pandemic, we have partnered with area hotels and motels to provide long-term sheltering. So on any, most of the time we are hoteling roughly 4 or 5 different families for long periods of time and helping them find housing after the shelter stay ends. We also have three different grants that we have been able to have to support families with rental assistance. So I believe right now we have 30 different families that we're actually providing housing to. And we partner with landlords to do that. We don't own our own housing, but we will partner with landlords, and then survivors that we work with, when they find housing, we can pay their rent for a period of time until they can ideally become independent. We also have community education in the schools. So we have two staff members that go out into area schools and give presentations around teen dating violence and other sort of bullying, and how to have healthy friendships, as well as community presentations like this is happening right now. But we also give presentations to different workplaces, to law enforcement sometimes, to healthcare providers, so that they really have a good understanding of how to best support survivors that might be using their services. So I think that that might be all that I wanted to share about. Sorry, I haven't given a presentation in a long time, and I didn't, it was hard for me to time it well so that I could get enough time in for questions and answers, but happy to take any questions people have.
And those hotels or whomever motels that take them remain anonymous so that these survivors can't be found?
We don't publicly advertise which hotels that we work with, but since we cover a really big geographic area, we do share with the survivors that call us where the hotels are, so that they might be given a choice about which one they go to. Some people really want to stay in their community because they may have a job or their kids are in school, and others want to get as far away as possible. Todd.
Yeah, I'm wondering on it looks like Maine is 50% higher than the national average. 30% instead of 20%. And you went through the I guess myths of what causes it, but I kind of wondered what are the root causes really then? And I mean, we know what the behaviors are from what you've said and so forth, the kind of things that identify that, but are there root causes, and what is it about Maine that we have a 50% higher rate than the rest of the country?
That's a good question. So, I mean, I think, if we knew why people, chose violence towards a partner, I think, we don't know for sure why certain people do. I mean, I think that there are many different messages that kids and adults are given about how to behave in relationships. I know, I have two young children. I have a girl and a boy, and I know that the messages that my son receives are sometimes pretty different from what my daughter receives. And so I think that depending on sort of the environment where they're raised, if this is acceptable behavior, then I think that people may be more likely to use these tactics. I mean, they work. I would say, like, a lot of people, when they have this intervention, I had spoken to the fact that anger management is not the intervention.
Yeah.
What is the intervention is a domestic violence intervention program. This is a statewide intervention program. It's usually court ordered, and it is a 48-week class that perpetrators of domestic violence are court ordered to take as part of their probation. And a lot of people in this class, they say, I use these tactics because I get what I want. It's really nice to be in a relationship and not have to compromise. And I feel differently. I like, how, I can have a nice, respectful conversation and resolve conflict in a different way. But I think a lot of people, really appreciate what they get from using violence and abuse. So it's hard to understand, but
Does the 48-week course work?
well, it's hard to know. I would say that the recidivism rate is lower for people that complete it. Not everybody completes it. There's, high expectation for how you participate in that class, and people are asked to leave if they are not participating properly. But for people that do complete it, they tend to not get arrested for domestic violence again. However, speaking to survivors and victims of domestic violence, we do hear sometimes that people just learn how to hide the abuse. Like, But I think that it is probably as good as any intervention. You know, we haven't found one that works better than this, but it's certainly not a cure for domestic abuse. I would say that, you know, people have to want to change. You know,
Right.
the intervention really comes from within. They have to be accountable to what has happened and say, you know, I made a mistake. This is my fault. This is my problem, not theirs. And I want to be intentional about living a different way.
Hannah,
Yes.
does Maine have a red flag law that if a person is threatening or violent, that they would take their weapons away?
What's that?
I don't know.
Well, I think that we have a yellow flag law, and so the intervention often has to come from a mental health provider. However, when somebody gets a protection order, which is like a restraining order, they often do check a box that does require law enforcement to take the guns away. And we've done a lot of work at the statewide level to try to actually enforce that, because a lot of times, you know, an abuser may just give their gun to their brother or to a friend. And so law enforcement this past year, especially since the mass shooting in Lewiston, they have actually done more to actually make sure that when a victim checks the box that the abuser has guns, that they actually follow through and take the guns to a secure location.
And if a person was physically violent to somebody, would they be allowed to have guns?
It depends. Yes. The answer is usually yes. If they have been convicted of domestic violence and are to the level of a felony, they would have to they would not be allowed to have guns any longer. But just getting a protection order, a lot of times they might have their guns removed for a period of time, but then they get them back after the order expires, which is usually 1 or 2 years.
Hannah, I remember a situation in which a husband was abusive for at least 5, 6 years. And the wife decided she could not put up with it really any longer. And she said that she would be leaving. Her husband said, "If you leave me, I will kill you."
Mm-hmm.
Sadly, she put up with it for another year and it still became worse. And she finally left him. And he followed through and ended up killing her.
Mm-hmm.
Is this a common situation in Maine? Is it unique? Is this the type of tactic a husband might use to just threaten killing that individual in that type of way? Where does it fit in the spectrum of abuse?
Well, I would say most people leave successfully. You know, we help hundreds of people leave a year, you know, every year. And in Maine, we have roughly 30 homicides a year. And of those 30, about 50% are domestic violence related. So kind of going back to your point, Todd, about why Maine is higher, I think that Maine has just we have lower crime in general. And so I think that domestic violence is a more, you know, common crime because we don't have other kinds of crime. But no, I would say that, you know, it's a threat that we take very seriously, especially when somebody has threatened to kill. That threat to kill is one that we take seriously and that we want survivors to take seriously. There are other threats that, you know, or other things that might happen that raise the person's risk. So if the abuser has threatened suicide, that increases the risk of homicide greatly. If they have a history of abusing other partners, that increases the person's risk of homicide, as well as stalking and sexual violence. So there are 5 different risk factors that increase a survivor's risk of homicide. But it's very uncommon in Maine for a survivor or victim to be murdered, but it certainly does happen, and we want people to take it seriously. Yeah, Todd.
Sorry, another question. But I worked retail for a while, and it happened to be in a wine and liquor store. I mean, a really nice one, but occasionally you'd have people come in, you kind of wonder, has this person been hit? And I was never quite sure how best to respond to that situation. Usually I would mention it to another woman. If she would be able to talk to this woman, quietly on the side so that she wasn't maybe perceptions of risk or threat because there's a man talking to her, if there's another man around who might get upset by that or whatever the different things. I wasn't sure really what do you do. But of course it still caused you concern and you don't know if maybe the person just fell down on the ice and it
Mhm.
is what it is. But I wonder what recommendations you give to people when they think that they know that that's going on somewhere in their sphere
Yeah.
and what they should do.
Well, I don't think that there's any real great answer to that. I would say that having a stranger approaching you on the street is, probably not going to be the intervention that a victim needs to get the help that they need. I would say that it's best if it comes from a loved one or a family member. Um, and I think that, doing it in a private and a non-judgmental way, not obviously not asking about what's happened in front of any other family members or certainly not
Right.
the potential perpetrator. Um,
Right.
but you know, we find that, if somebody is direct and says, I'm worried about you. I see this, these are the things I'm seeing. Can you share with me what's going on? And being a source of support in that way. It's important that loved ones also know that it's probably not going to be the intervention that causes the person to leave permanently. Usually survivors will leave several times before they leave permanently. There's lots of reasons for that. And I would say the number one reason is because they love their partner. It's really hard to end a relationship with somebody that you care so much about. People who use violence are not monsters. They are people in our communities that we interact with regularly. And they have many wonderful qualities. And, if you have this marriage and you have children with the person, it's really hard. So being open about what you're seeing and also saying, I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm not here to try to take you away from this person, but I want you to know that I'm here if you need me, is a really helpful intervention with the victim. Um, and with a perpetrator, I mean, I think that that's also, why people continue to use violence is because they're not held accountable. So if you know that a person is using violence or abuse towards their partner, that can be tricky. I think it's also important to hold abusers accountable, though, and to try to have a private conversation where you're not confronting them and saying, you're doing this. I want you to stop and trying to be aggressive towards them is certainly not a strategy I would suggest. But being open and honest and saying, I'm here to help you. I'm worried about your relationship, and I'm worried that your partner's going to leave you because you're not treating them well. I think that being open and honest is also helpful with perpetrators of violence too.
To piggyback on Todd's comment, my horse, the side of her head hit my face, knocked me unconscious. I'm on the ground, get up, go to the trauma and have a plastic surgeon stitch me up. So I've got stitches on my face. My whole face is black. And how people treated me. When she was stitching me up, she said, it's amazing they didn't separate you and your husband in the ER. But he was cleaning blood up and he was caring for me. And I guess they just observed how we reacted together. But no one was, except when I walked into church, the pastor's wife never asked me anything. She just threw her arms around me. But no one else even asked me any way, shape, or form what happened.
Mm.
And my husband and I laughed about, he's got a lot of courage walking along the street beside me when I looked like I looked.
I remember that.
But I think we need so much of what you're doing tonight to educate the community.
Yeah.
Because if I hadn't had self-esteem or, knowing what really happened, I wouldn't have had any self-esteem. I would have felt, I was ugly and couldn't work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And we actually have done quite a lot of, training with medical providers to, I'm sure many of us have had the experience of going in and having the person kind of going through the list. Are you, do you have enough to eat? Are you safe at home? Do you have a firearm? And they kind of just ask these questions, and you don't really feel like you have the opportunity to share. So we're really trying to help medical providers to ask it in a really compassionate way where it really allows the person to share, and they're not. When I was pregnant, they asked me that every week with my husband, or not every week, every month when I had my checkups. My husband would be in the room and they would be saying, "Are you safe at home?" Yeah, like I'm going to say anything if I'm actually being abused. So, we do try to provide a lot of education to the community so that people really know the right intervention. And New Hope, as well as many other domestic violence agencies, we have these little wooden nickels that you might see around. We have posters in different bathrooms so that people will hopefully see our information in a private space and be able to call us.
Call if you have a
Oh.
problem.
Anna?
Yeah.
Do you think it'd be okay to, what you talked about, to teach that to high school kids?
Oh, yeah.
That women could just kind of see, that wheel that you had and, it seems like that would be helpful, just that they know about it and just talk about it. And
Mhm.
it seems like that would be very important in the schools.
Well,
Otherwise, I don't know how you would reach out to them, how they would know unless they talked about it.
mhm. Yeah, well, I mean, Jeff, in Maine, we do a lot. We are in many of the different high schools, giving presentations and trying to be to help women and boys to know about abuse and how to treat people in a relationship. But I think that I don't know if other states do that. But we definitely do encourage school settings to have us in and have this education.
That's good.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we're wrapping up, but I'll just put out a plug that if people do live locally and that you're interested in knowing more, we always are happy to talk. I'm happy to have an email and set up a call. We also, for our 24-hour helpline, we staff that with staff members during the day, but at night and on weekends, we rely on volunteers. And so if you have any interest in supporting victims and survivors on our helpline, we have a 44-hour training that prepares people to do that. It's a very informative training and really kind of goes into a lot more detail around what options are available for survivors and why domestic violence occurs. And so if you or somebody might be a good volunteer, we would love to talk to them about it. I can put my email address in the chat, or maybe Alicia can send it out, but let me see. I'll put it in the chat for now. And happy to talk more about that.
I have one more question for you.
Sure.
We had a young couple several years ago in one of our churches that we served who was the victim. He was the victim of domestic violence, and upper middle class educated couple. They look like Ken and Barb, and when he was sharing his story with us, he said how difficult it was to get anyone to believe that he was the member of the relationship getting abused from this sweet, pretty wife. And it was very heartbreaking for his family and friends and people that knew him and trusted him and his story to listen to the pain he went through for years, to then and also try to get out of this relationship. Do you see that side of things, and how often? Or
Yeah. So, and I apologize because I think that this presentation has been really focused on women's being the victim and men being the perpetrator. But we do, New Hope changed our name 2 years ago because we wanted to be more inclusive. We were New Hope for Women. Now we're New Hope Midcoast because we have always worked with men or people of any gender, transgender people, people who are non-binary, and we want anyone to feel safe reaching out to us for support. And we do hear from men. I don't know specifically what the statistic is. I think it's between 10 and 15% of our clients are men. Many of them are being abused by other men, but many of them are being abused by women. So we certainly will work with people regardless of their gender or what the nature is of their relationship. People sometimes,
Hannah, can
you know,
you,
men-
no.
Oh, I was just gonna say, people sometimes say men have a hard time reaching out. I would say women have a hard time reaching out too. It takes a lot of courage to call and share what's going on in a relationship. And I think that we do try to inform the community that we will work with anyone and regardless. Sorry.
Hannah, can you hear me?
I can. Yeah, hey Joe.
Uh, There was a question asked about the red flag law. That's a good current question. Yesterday, a petition was filed with 75,000 signatures to put the red flag law on the ballot for this coming fall. We have, a yellow flag law, which was enforced in the Lewiston disaster. And the parents asked the police which was under the yellow flag law, to file a complaint. The police failed to do that. That's all public knowledge, and caused a lot of us to say we need the red flag law, which allows anybody in a family to go to court and say that somebody in their family should not have a gun, should have any they have removed, and should not be able to buy one. That will be on the ballot, and I hope everybody listening will vote in support of that when it's on the ballot. The petitions were just filed, I think, yesterday or the day before.
Thanks for sharing that, Joe. Yeah. I mean, firearms, I think obviously people have different opinions on them. What we know is that in Maine, and during a 20-year period of 2000 to 2020, about 65% of domestic violence homicide was carried out with the use of a firearm. So, it definitely increases somebody's risk. Sometimes people will say, oh, survivors and victims should get guns. But having a weapon in the home, a firearm in the home, increases the risk of homicide by 500% for a female victim. And that was a 2008 study, which I can share the source if people want it. But having a gun, even a victim having a gun on their own, if there is violence occurring in the home, it does increase the person's risk of homicide. Well, this has been a really lovely discussion, and I appreciate people's questions and taking the time to hear about this subject that I know has affected many people in our community, and I hope that you've been able to learn something that you can take with you. And I'm always happy to talk more if people want to set up another time to talk.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you, Hannah, for doing a
you.
great job. Yeah.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank
very
So
much.
much for sharing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Good night.